All right, so let's delve a bit more deeply into conditionals. And things will get a little bit complicated here. Um, you know, for reasons, like I said, the conditional is probably the hardest of these, and there's some real philosophical issues, some debates around using this arrow symbol to stand for conditionals. It doesn't capture everything we mean by if-then statements for reasons we'll get to. All right. So let's launch into some logically equivalent expressions to the conditional. These will all be useful. The first of these will be useful next week when we talk about necessary and sufficient conditions. The others will be useful in a couple weeks when we finally get to this tableau method of determining validity with these, expressions in symbolic logic or propositional logic. All right, so the first logically equivalent expression is if A then B. Remember, we have these little three bars to indicate logical equivalency, a little bit of, symbolism. You know, A arrow B is logically equivalent to not B arrow not A. Which means anytime you see A arrow B, you could replace it with not B arrow not A. Now, why does this work? Why are these two equivalent? Well, remember modus tollens, right? If A, then B. Well, if you add not B to that, you get not A, because remember, the first expression is saying, well, every time you have A, you also get B. You know from the fact that you don't have B that you don't have A, right? If it is true that every time it snows, we cancel class, and we didn't cancel class, then you know it didn't snow, right? So, part of this is just very intuitive from the fact that modus tollens is a valid form of argument. A arrow B, if that's true, then it's also true that not B arrow not A, right? Just from this idea of modus tollens, which we've already talked about, which is a valid form of argument and one that makes sense, I think, when you look at it, right? If you really want to get into this, we can look at our truth table, though, right? And if we're talking about logical equivalency, we should always look at the truth table. Remember, two statements are logically equivalent if they have exactly the same values on every line of the truth table. Well, if A then B is only false when A is true and B is false, right? Here on line 3, right? Well, not B, so not A. Well, that's going to be false. Remember, not B will be true whenever B is false. So that would be line 3 as well. So not B would be true. Not A will be false whenever A is true. So the A would be false by the same reasons. It'll be false on this line as well, right? You can go through and methodically fill these in if you want to. It's kind of boring, but they have exactly the same values on the truth table, logically equivalent, and for reasons we've already talked about. It's intuitive given this valid form of argument modus tollens that the two expressions are logically equivalent. Now, why is this important? This is actually important because next week, when we talk about, necessary and sufficient conditions, I'll actually argue that I think this not B then not A is a more natural or intuitive way to symbolize these necessary conditions that we'll talk about next week than the other way around. But they're logically equivalent, they mean the same thing. I just think the not will work better, so it's important to know this. Another logically equivalent expression to if A then B is not A and not B, right? A arrow B is equivalent to saying it is not the case that A is true and B is false. That's also pretty intuitive. If I tell you, as the conditional does, whenever you have B, whenever you have A, you have B as well, well, then it has to be false that you could have A and not have B, right? This will be important because when we talk about the tableau method, the fact that these two expressions are equivalent will be important when you try to use the tableau method we'll talk about in a few weeks with conditionals. Again, same lines are true on the truth table. If you want to go in and methodically fill these in, we've already seen this for A arrow B, not A and B. Since we have this not outside this expression is only false, well, when A is true and B is false, that's the only line where the conditional is false. The expressions are logically equivalent. Finally, and this is the most counterintuitive of these, but if A then B is also logically equivalent to not A v B, not A or B, right? But think about it too, right? This not A or B is going to be true in every case except when A is true, because the not A will be false, and B is false. That's the only line that's going to come out as false. And you could also think about, if you want to use, we've talked about De Morgan's rules, if you wanted to use them in double negation with this not A and not B, you could get this. I'm not going to do this. I might give you this, guys, this is a homework. You could get this expression not A or B. This is not intuitive, the fact that this is logically equivalent to A arrow B in the way the other two are, but it is true. Now, I think this is all pretty intuitive, except one problem you run into, and one way that this expression A arrow B might not capture, in fact, does not capture some of what we mean by the conditional in English. You can see on line 4 of the truth table from the fact that whenever A is false, and 2, right, anytime A is false, then the conditional is true, right? When we talk about antecedents and consequence, antecedent is A, B is the consequent, right? Whenever the antecedent is false on every single line, the conditional statement is true. Now, as we've already seen, there are reasons to think this. There are ways that English works like this, But this means that this statement does a really bad job, in fact, no job at all, of capturing some of what we mean by if-then in English. Now consider this statement, right? The arrow works perfectly well here. If Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy in Dallas, then someone else did, right? This statement is, I think, true, right? Look, somebody killed Kennedy. It happened in Dallas. If Oswald didn't do it, somebody else did. Somebody had to have shot the man, right? But think about this statement. If Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy in Dallas, someone else would have. Now look, if you are someone who believes the Kennedy assassination was a conspiracy, you might think this was true. But it is not saying the same thing as the earlier statement, right? It is obviously true that if Oswald didn't do it, someone else did, right? It is not obviously true that if he didn't do it, someone else would have, right? I actually think he acted alone. I think if he hadn't shot Kennedy, no one would have shot Kennedy, at least in Dallas, right? Some other assassin might have done it. It might have been successful. I don't know. But, you know, I don't think this statement is true. But if we symbolize it using our arrow, it is, right? The antecedent Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy is false, I think. So any statement using the arrow is going to be true. The point here, and this is not going to be super important when you guys do the test or anything else, but it's a point to keep in mind, is that using the arrow for if-then statements doesn't seem to do very well with so-called counterfactual statements. A counterfactual is a statement is one that makes a claim about how the world would be if certain things were different, right? Here's just a random list of them. If Germany won World War I, Hitler wouldn't have come to power. The Earth didn't have a magnetic field, it couldn't support life. If Michael Jackson's Thriller wasn't the best-selling album of all time, AC/DC's Back in Black would be. If my uncle hadn't been gullible, he wouldn't have sent Oral Roberts money. If you guys don't know, Oral Roberts was one of these crooked televangelists. I don't know if he's still alive. I don't think he is. But one of the way he raised money was he said, well, God has told me that he's going to kill me if I don't raise X dollars by Y date. My uncle, as a boy, used to listen to Oral Roberts. He did not want God to kill Oral, so he sent him some money. My mom made fun of him about this for years. My uncle as a grown-up was not gullible enough to send Oral Roberts money, but my uncle as a boy was. My mom would mock my uncle about this for years. If he hadn't been that gullible, at least as a child, he would not have sent Oral Roberts money, but he did. If Kennedy hadn't have been shot, LBJ would have never been president. If I hadn't went to Sylvetus Elementary, I'd have gone to Yale. Me and my friend Joe used to say this. We went to a really terrible elementary school. We were half joking. We probably wouldn't have went, whatever. If the dinosaurs hadn't been wiped out, humans would have never evolved. If I weren't teaching logic this semester, I'd be teaching Intro to Philosophy. If Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, the 45th president would have been a man. If America had a king, he'd be bald, right? Each of these makes a statement about how the world would be if something were different. Now, in each of these cases, the first part of the statement is false, right? By definition, the world isn't this way. We're talking about how things would be if the world were different. The thing is, some counterfactuals seem like they're true, and some definitely seem like they're false. Think about this, right? Some counterfactuals clearly seem like they're true, right? 2, 3, 4, and 7, right? Probably 5 as well. The Earth didn't have a magnetic field. I'm told that it wouldn't have an atmosphere. The sun would just blow the atmosphere away. Maybe something could live here if that weren't if we didn't have an atmosphere. Human beings certainly couldn't, right? I Googled this. Thriller, most popular album of all time, best-selling. Back in Black, number 2. Thriller hadn't sold so well, then probably true. Back in Black would be, the number 2. My uncle hadn't been gullible. He wouldn't have sent Oral Roberts money. 7, who knows, but if dinosaurs hadn't been wiped out, we probably couldn't have ever evolved, right? Arguably, if you look at history, 5 is true as well. Kennedy, both JFK and his brother Robert, hated Lyndon Johnson and would have done everything they could to make sure he was never president, right? LBJ also hated them. Politics does weird things. They picked him as vice president because they needed to win the state of Texas, but both parties absolutely hated each other's guts. Um, so Johnson would have likely never been president if Kennedy hadn't been shot. But other counterfactuals seem clearly false. 9, for instance, right? You know, Clinton won, should have been the 45th president. Clinton's a woman. Well, right? If I say if she won, the president would have been a man, that just seems almost a contradiction in terms. That conditional is, or that counterfactual is false. If we use the arrow and we say they're all true, that just doesn't get 9, right? Look, you can even go with absolutely crazy statements, right? Counterfactual. If I got a haircut yesterday, I mean I didn't. My hair's still way too long. Triangles would only have 2 sides. That seems nuts. But if we use the arrow to stand for the counterfactual statement, then this comes out true. Look, I don't know what to do with this. The easy thing is just to say counterfactual statements are not, we use if then, often with a would or a could or whatever, to talk about these. Well, if the world was different in some way, this other thing would be different as well. There's whole books are written about this in philosophy. They're very confusing books. I won't go any further in this issue. Just know that the arrow does not really model these counterfactual statements. It's one thing that's kind of left out. I'm not going to get into this debate. It's not important for our purposes. It is just enough to know that if you see an if-then statement that is clearly a counterfactual, you can't use the arrow to symbolize it. There's a lot more to be said by this. Many of you, that lot more would bore you, and some of you it would both bore and confuse, so I won't say it. Just know there are some if-then statements that the arrow doesn't work for. We will focus on the ones it does work for, though.